The Indianapolis Colts will compete with the Houston Texans live on Saturday on a special edition of Monday Night Football for a spot in the postseason. The playoffs are practically starting early for the Colts, as a win would give us that coveted postseason berth, and a loss would end our season right then and there. It's going to strengthen the division rivalry no matter how it ends. So let's break it down from the Colts perspective. We'll start off today's episode by breaking down the Colts playoff clinching scenarios, because there's actually more to it than you might think. Of course, the easy part is just that this game right here is win and in. If we win, we're in the playoffs. If we lose, we're out. But if the Jaguars manage to lose to Tennessee on Sunday, we might actually have a chance of hosting a playoff game as the 4 seed in Lucas Oil Stadium. Of course, we'd have to beat the Texans and then see the Jaguars fall to the Titans, and we would then be AFC South division champions in that scenario. If the Jaguars win the division, we win, and the Dolphins beat the Bills, we get the 6 seed, which means that we get to go play Kansas City on the road, which the teams that we could play in the playoffs are either the Browns if we win the division, or it's the Bills, the Dolphins, or the Chiefs. I would much prefer to play the Chiefs in every scenario than either the Bills or the Dolphins. I think the Dolphins have, they're obviously one of the better teams in the AFC, and I think they have a lot of advantages over us. I think they would win that game. The Bills are white hot. I want to stay as far away from them as possible. The Chiefs are one of the only teams in the AFC that feels like they're falling, right? Their performance has downgraded in the last few weeks. I would love to catch the Chiefs on that downward slope, be the 6 seed, go to Kansas City. I think that would give us the best chance of winning a playoff game. Obviously, we have to get there first, and we're going to talk about the Texans game in particular, but if we get there, if we could beat the Texans, I would love to be the 6 seed. And in that case, I'm cheering for the Dolphins to knock the Bills down there. And if the Bills win that game, then we would be going to Buffalo. So let's talk about the Texans, right? They're 9-7, and they've struggled to put a series of wins together, especially towards the end of this season. CJ Stroud missed week 15, and their top receiver, Nico Collins, missed week 16. But both of them are expected, they both played in week 17 last week against Tennessee. They're both expected to play again this weekend and really just the rest of the season. Now, the Texans' identity is primarily predicated on the pass game. They have 1,587 rush yards on the season and 4,314 receiving or passing yards on the season. That's almost 4 times more, right? So they throw the ball and they gain yards through the air almost 4 times more than they do on the ground. They have the second most yards per reception in the entire league. That is what fuels their offense the most. If the passing game is down, they're probably not going to be very productive on offense and ultimately lose the game. But if the opposite is true, the Texans are dangerous and can beat nearly anyone in the AFC. So let's look at the Houston Texans position by position to kind of get a better idea of who they are, how they win, how they play the game. We'll start at quarterback. CJ Stroud, of course, is the rookie quarterback that is lighting the world on fire in Houston. His 3,844 yards on the season and a 21-5 touchdown to interception ratio makes him an undisputed top 10 quarterback in 2023. He doesn't throw very many interceptions either. He just has 5 the whole season. And in addition to his eccentric passing game, he can keep plays alive with his legs, and he has done that on multiple occasions throughout this entire season. The Texans have relied on him to win games over and over. They need him to make a play, to be the difference in winning a game for the Texans, and he has done that on multiple occasions this season, and he may have to do that again this week. The offensive line isn't bad either. It can be overwhelmed by elite pass rushes. DeForest Buckner, for example, I could see him getting in the backfield. But the Texans O-line is certainly not a liability, especially when you look at the running back position, where Devin Singletary has been awesome this year and remains a pending threat, an ever-present threat to scamper for 10-plus yards, especially on runs to the outside. The Texans, like I said, they rely far more on the passing game to win on offense, but when they do turn to Singletary, he often shows up for them. Now, at receiver, this passing game is the hallmark of the Texans' success so far this season. They're 4th in the league in total receiving yards. CJ Stroud throws to Nico Collins the most, but there's a wide variety of different receivers that can produce strong numbers on this team. Robert Woods, Tank Dell, Dalton Schultz, even the tight end, they've all commanded significant attention so far this season, and Nico Collins is capable of producing numbers similar to Davante Adams last week against the Raiders. So this Texans team, they have a strong number one receiver in Nico Collins. CJ Stroud can get the ball to any of them, but there's a wide variety of receivers that the Colts may need to worry about, which isn't necessarily something that was a factor in the Raiders game last week, because Davante Adams was the main receiver. He was getting the majority of catches, and Jacoby Myers had a good game, and Austin Hooper, but for the most part, Davante Adams was the one guy the Colts needed to stop. For the Texans, that's Nico Collins, but there's a much shorter gap between Nico Collins and the rest of the Texans receivers than there is with the Raiders, with Davante Adams and everyone else. Now, on the defensive side of the ball, the Houston Texans, their front seven, it does enough, right? You have guys like Will Anderson Jr., Sheldon Rankins, Henry To'oTo'o, and some others. They highlight a group that can get through to the quarterback if they're given the opportunity. They're not necessarily going to force the issue and dominate every single offensive line in the league. But if the Colts offensive line is having a bad game, almost like they did last week against the Raiders, where Gardner Minshew was feeling pressure from that Raiders pass rush, the Texans are very capable of taking advantage of that with their front seven, and that's something the Colts, particularly in the offensive line, really want to lock down and make sure isn't an issue for Indianapolis on Saturday. But the Texans' main issue across this entire team is their secondary. It's their most prominent weakness overall for this Houston Texans team. Their pass defense is almost unanimously bottom 5 in the league. It lets up a ton of yardage and really doesn't have much of a threat that it's going to intercept any errant throws. This secondary is the most exploitable aspect of this Texans defense and this entire Texans team. If the Colts, if Gardner Minshew and Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, all of those guys, if they can penetrate this secondary and really attack this secondary early on in the game, there's a much better chance that the Colts are going to stay in this game and potentially win it at the end. So it makes sense that Texans team is 9-7 and sort of a fringe playoff contender, but is that going to be enough to avenge their Week 2 loss against the Colts? Let's look at how the Colts can win this game, what their game keys are to take down the Texans. The number one thing, I just mentioned it, the number one thing that I want to see for this Colts team is attacking the secondary on offense. If Gardner Minshew and Michael Pittman can put together a performance anywhere close to what Joe Flacco and Amari Cooper did a couple weeks ago in Week 16, this game is way more likely to swing in the favor of the Colts. The passing game needs to be on point, right? 8 different receivers caught the ball for the Colts against the Raiders. If we can see multiple different guys get open on at least every other play, right? Every passing play to have someone have an opportunity to catch a pass, that is going to be very, very important for this Colts team in attacking a weak secondary. That is the Texans' biggest liability. But perhaps what's even more important is the offensive line giving Gardner Minshew time to get the ball to those open receivers. Last week, we saw a direct correlation between the amount of time Gardner Minshew had in a safe pocket and his ability to throw an accurate pass and gain significant yardage. And lastly, it's just don't let Stroud cook you, right? CJ Stroud is amazing. He's a top 10 quarterback in the league, and a lot of his throws are sort of that air raid offense with those short 5 to 15 yard gains. And last week against the Raiders, the Colts massively struggled in defending passes in that yard range, right? We took away the deep ball very well. The run game was performed about at the level we expected it to for Vegas, but it was those 10 to 15 yard gains. The Raiders had those passes and they had those catches all day long, and we noticed that at the final drive where Aiden O'Connell could just throw a first down on every single play because his guys were always wide open. Of course, the Colts play a lot of cover 3, which is a coverage that has its merits, but of course, one of the main weaknesses is those underneath routes, which is something that CJ Stroud has taken advantage of all year long very effectively. So replicating the same defensive performance for the Colts is not going to be what we want to see heading into this Saturday against the Texans. Keeping that aspect of the Texans offense, the passing game, keeping that at bay will be critical in keeping the Texans from running away from this game, pulling out to an early lead, and leaving the Colts in the dust. No matter how you cut it, the Colts and the Texans are going to come down to the wire this Saturday night, and it's going to come down to which team's clutch factor is triumphant over the other. Gardner Minshew and the Colts may need to put together a strong fourth quarter drive late in the fourth quarter and really succeed in those moments. And the defense may need to make some key stops in the fourth quarter. So which team's clutch factor is going to be triumphant here in their first primetime opportunity? Both teams have not had a primetime game all year long. But A night game, 8:15 on Saturday night. We get to see Lucas Oil at night, and one of these teams is going to the playoffs. And the Colts just need to prove that that team can be them. I think that we will. I think the Colts will win this game. There may, of course, be some Colts fan bias here, but it is a show called The Colts Perspective. I think that Indianapolis will come out on top 34-31, clinch a playoff spot, and more specifically, I think we'll be the 7th seed and head to Buffalo on wild card weekend. But no matter who we could play, or where we could play them, or what our likelihood of winning a playoff game even is in the first place, I think I speak for all Colts fans when I say that I just want to see this team get back to the playoffs for the first time since Phillip Rivers was our quarterback, which feels like a totally different universe at this point. All I want to see is this team get back to the playoffs. Of course, it would be a little bit disappointing if they didn't. It's been a great season, overachieving expectations overall, especially considering the fact that Anthony Richardson got hurt earlier in the year and Shaq Leonard isn't on the team anymore. We're one game away from the playoffs, regardless of how this game goes. I am excited about this Colts season. I'm very excited about next season. But getting to the playoffs would feel very great, especially if we did it without Anthony Richardson, without Shaq Leonard. I hope the Colts can get to the playoffs. I know you do too. Let's enjoy it from the Colts perspective.